So when I first wrote this script, I had a 6-month-old and I now have an 8-month-old. I feel like I have to start every video with a thank you for your patience. I wanted to read Spare in its entirety before making a video on it, and that just takes a lot of time when you have a little one running around. It's been months since the release, but Spare still chops. We're doing really good, guys. Still tops the charts in some areas of the world, so maybe I'm doing okay on the timing? Probably not, but anyway, here goes. I don't really know how to structure this video. I have 7 pages of notes that I somehow have to streamline into a video script that makes some sort of sense. So if it seems like I'm jumping around a bit, it's because I am, and I am doing my best. There were aspects of this book that I found frustrating, and I would absolutely love to get Meghan Markle's unfettered opinion on some of Harry's family drama, but I want to make it clear, and I think it is obvious, that everything in this video outside of direct quotes is my opinion. There are times that I put on my armchair psychology voice, and I realize that skirts a very thin line. Anyway, finally on to the topic at hand. Spare is Harry's memoir, the first in a reported 4-book series, although I don't think that has actually been confirmed, so don't quote me anywhere on that. Of course, despite promises from the UK press that absolutely no one was going to read it, Spare sold more than 1.4 million copies on its release day, beating President Obama's previous record. Spare set the record for first-day sales of a non-fiction book in the UK, selling 400,000 copies there alone. The release of the book was promoted by a few high-profile interviews by Harry, my favorite, of course, being the one with Stephen Colbert. So, early childhood stuff, I know it shouldn't have surprised me, but the discrepancy in the treatment of Harry and William, even when they were in single digits, was really surprising to me. The late 80s, early 90s were really not that long ago in the grand scheme of things, but the way Harry writes makes it feel like they were raised in the late 1800s instead of the 20th century. The different sizes of rooms, the difference in treatment from staff and certain family members. William was even offered better food. This is one of the only areas I have a whiff of sympathy for William. Looking at how he was treated, given better things, put in better spaces, protected from the press to much more of a degree, it's hard to see how he could have turned out as anything other than a raging narcissistic asshole. It would have taken a gargantuan effort on his part to overcome being the golden child on steroids, and I just don't think that was ever going to be in his emotional wheelhouse. And I will talk about this more later, there seems to be an active plan in place by the actual firm, meaning courtiers, whatever, to make sure that royals are infantilized to a degree, a process that, according to Harry, begins in literal infancy. Spare, of course, generated some major headlines, but I think some of the worst damage it does to the British royal family comes in some of the quieter parts. The family comes across as very stiff, even using British standards, and one of their core defenses over the years has been that they're actually like a, quote, normal family behind the scenes. First, the Netflix doc, notably with Meghan highlighting that they do all in fact bow to the Queen in private, and that they were just as stiff behind the scenes, and now with a lot of Harry's personal stories in Spare, that defense is completely eaten away at. Harry revealing that they were expected to bow to a statue of Queen Victoria, or that something as little as a touch on the cheek was reserved for very special occasions, again, even in private. And some of that stiffness really seems to cross the line of abuse or neglect, and I don't say that lightly. Harry recalling that when his father came to tell him his mother was dead, he was then left alone for a long period of time at the age of 12. The boys were left alone to, in a literal sense, beat the shit out of each other and their friends. The forced financial dependence on his father, which of course lasted well into adulthood. The fact that Harry had no doubt that he was a spare, even as a young child. I think that something that caught a lot of people by surprise is how sad the tone of Spare is. I used to be one of those people who never cried, and kinda had pride in that fact for gross reasons, of course. That has all since changed. Now I have a baby. And of course I'm reading the story now as the mother of a very young son, which is a different perspective than I had previously. And I gotta tell you guys, a lot of the Diana stuff, especially when Harry is describing how he convinced himself she wasn't really gone as a coping strategy, had me completely in tears. It's impossible to read the rest of Spare and not wonder what would have happened if Diana was still alive. Not only was Harry the literal spare, the scapegoat of the royal family, he comes across as a deeply empathetic and emotional person like his mother. Of course, Diana left 2 sons behind, but it really feels like William had the firm and Harry had nothing after her loss. One of my big takeaways from Spare that I didn't know previously was that the Spencer side was pitching a fit that the boys were expected to grieve publicly. You know, I was like 5 when Diana died. I have no memory of the events of her funeral, but as an adult finding an interest in the royal family, I was just like, WTF, watching those videos of both Harry and William being trotted out days after her death and during the funeral. It's gross, and both William and Harry should have been sheltered by their family. Talking about his struggles with grief and how over time and with help he got to a better place are the strongest parts of Spare. And I think most people have experiences with grief and loss in their own lives. It's something that connects all of us, and I think Harry being open about his experiences and struggles is helpful and reassuring to a lot of us. And through talking about his struggles, he becomes a human in front of us, not just the caricature that the British press promotes at every opportunity. I also found it surprising about how funny Harry is. I realize that Spare was written with help, but you get a sense that Harry has a very good and self-deprecating sense of humor, which comes through a lot when he's discussing the years between his mother's death and entering the military. You can't help but feel sorry for this kid who acknowledges that classroom academics are not his strong suit, yet is forced to go to Eton because of the optics, whose older brother pointedly tells him to pretend that they don't know each other, who cannot participate in the normal acting out that most teens participate in without finding himself on the front of tabloids. Then you add on top of all of that he is poorly working through significant grief, and you find yourself wanting to give that kid a hug. And it's in this section of the book that it becomes clear why Charles was so worried about what Harry would say about Camilla, because Harry comes out and says that Camilla would leak against both William and himself in order to improve the public opinion of Charles. Now, I'm going to spend a minute here talking about Camilla, but I want to be clear that she did what she did with the permission of Charles. I think that even sometimes squatties fall into the trap of shaming Camilla and letting Charles off pretty easy, but all of Camilla's power comes from Charles. He could have stopped all this, and he didn't, so just keep that in mind. Harry plainly lays most, if not all, of the worst press treatment in his late teens, early adulthood at Camilla's feet, claiming that he was often fed to the press at her behest, specifically that it was erroneously leaked that he went to rehab in his teens. Charles went from an adulterer to a poor single father with a drugged-out son. Harry brings up that details from the first meeting between Charles, Camilla, guys. Charles, Camilla, and William were leaked to the press. That the brothers would often express frustration with each other about the leaks coming from Camilla's camp. Camilla's ability to hold a grudge has been a persistent rumor for 30-plus years, and you have to wonder if she ever forgave Charles's sons for telling him not to marry her. Harry thinks the goal of a lot of these leaks were to make the public more amenable for the marriage to take place. After their wedding, he thinks he was used to cover up for the poor behavior of Camilla's son. A line from the book that got a lot of attention was that despite the leaks and his own personal displeasure at his father remarrying, Harry sincerely wished Camilla would be happy because, quote, maybe she'd be less dangerous if she was happy, which gives us all some insight as to how much power at least Harry attributed to her. I also found it interesting the degree to which the press was willing to respect the hierarchy of the family. Camilla was deeply, deeply disliked in the decade following Diana's death. Tabloids would have, and at points did, sell a lot of papers with her on the cover along with a negative headline. But at some point that tipped, and they were willing to attack William and Harry. When things became clear that Camilla would be the next queen consort, the press fell in line. To jump forward in time a little bit, Harry does go out of his way to describe how nice Charles and Camilla were to Meghan, especially in contrast with the Cambridges, now Waleses. I found it very, very interesting that Harry thinks Camilla leaked the Meghan made Kate cry story. Remembering the timing of that story, it was so clearly a hit piece. Knowing that at least Harry is certain that it came from Camilla and arguably pit the two duchesses against each other is just, again, a masterclass in manipulation. You know the British press is bad when someone describes war-torn Afghanistan as a welcome reprieve from their cameras. A good chunk of Spare is Harry talking about his experience in the military and how those experiences gave him the family he desperately wanted and offered a productive distraction from the grief he was struggling with. To go back to my armchair psychology, I think a major problem royals have is that they just don't encounter normal, whatever that means, people all that often. You can tell that Harry had a different experience. He was by far the most approachable and low-key family member the firm had to offer. And while in ages past people expected royalty to be stilted, I think that's changing. You can clearly see how important the military community is to Harry. In nursing school, I spent a few months working at a local VA dom, which you aren't supposed to call them anymore, but I digress. And I encountered some guys who had recently returned from Iraq or Afghanistan. They were of a similar age to me, and it was so difficult to communicate with them. I would describe one gentleman as almost vibrating. He was so tightly wound. I don't think it's talked about enough how young most of these people were when they were sent to fight, and how ignored they have been since returning home. Harry's attempt to draw attention to the veterans of Iraq and Afghanistan are important and are dearly appreciated by those communities. I don't know if I actually necessarily believe Harry that he just decided to give it up to do royal work full time, but maybe that's going to be in a different book. This section of the book was also the first part which leaked after British tabloids got their hands on a Spanish copy of Spare and published sections claiming that Harry was bragging about his kill count, without of course giving any kind of context, and I think notably not disclosing that the passages had been translated into Spanish, then again into English. Of course, with the proper context, it was very clear that Harry was not bragging, and I'm sorry, but I have zero sympathy for anyone who goes to a British tabloid and then cries that their words were twisted. Everyone at this point should know better. Harry's experiences in the military, of course, led him to start the Invictus Games, which, in my opinion, will likely be Harry's legacy. The games have been wildly successful, and I think it was, of course, notable that Harry told his audience that William was angry that Harry successfully lobbied their Share Foundation for the funds to start it. You have to wonder if Harry had gone to William first, whether or not William would have tried to shut it down or tried harder to get his own name attached to the games. Throughout this section, I found myself thinking that Harry actually held it together really well, considered he blamed, not wrongly, the British tabloids for taking his mother, ruining almost every romantic relationship he was in, and trying to ruin his military career, which at the time was seemingly the only safe haven he had. I think I would have done much worse than push a camera away. I've often told people I think it would be fun to be famous for like a week. After reading Spare, I'm not sure I'd even want to be famous for that long. Reading Spare, you understand how important the military community and his own service is to Harry, which makes it even more shitty that it was that community that the royal family tried to distance him from after the Sussexes announced they were leaving, immediately stripping him of all his honorary titles, despite being the only royal family member in a generation to actually serve. It's then funny that the military community so openly supported Harry when the Sussexes came back to the UK in April of 2020. I bet that standing ovation stung many a royal heart. I also think the open refusal to lay a wreath on Remembrance Day for Harry was a huge misstep. It was cruel and petty, and it came across as so. For a family that likes to play dress up in military uniform they haven't earned, it feels strange that they would want to draw attention to their cruelty towards Harry. But whatever. Their PR team appears to be made up of mice in fancy suits. So, I want to talk about William now. And it's in these passages that I found myself being slightly surprised at how much Harry spoke about William, but also I found myself frustrated that Harry still seems to have a pretty big blind spot when it comes to his family and specifically his brother, which I will talk about in the end. I've already mentioned that I found it surprising, I shouldn't have, that the boys were treated so differently from the get-go, which of course sets them both up for failure. When I was reading for my Golden Child vs. Scapegoat video, I came across a narrative written by Golden Child who, as an adult, had realized how poorly his parents had treated his siblings, who he didn't have a relationship with because they hated him, and how poorly they had set him up for an adult life. He basically had to relearn how to interact with people, how to build up a friend group, how to hold down a job because he was taught by his parents the world would cater to him. I think it's important to note that with Heir vs. Spare, which is the royal version of Golden Child vs. Scapegoat, the real villains are the narcissistic parents who set up the dichotomy. That's not to say we can't hold adult William responsible for his choices. You will find that I am very much on the William sucks train. I think Harry confirmed what a lot of us have suspected, that William and Harry obviously have a trauma bond because of the death of their mother, but that there has been no great overarching friendship between the two as adults, and that their closeness was made up by the family and then the press. Neither were actually each other's best man in their respective weddings. I found it interesting that Harry points out that when he was in Afghanistan, he would call Chelsea or his father, but never his brother. They had different friend groups as adults. They had different experiences. William and Kate's wedding was a high point, and we'll talk about Kate in a little bit. And maybe this is just the way Harry tells the story, but I don't think it's a coincidence that right as the press are starting to talk about Will and Kate's laziness, that William seems to start leaning into the Heir vs. Spare dynamic more than he had previously. Harry tells us that he thought they were going to escape the true Heir vs. Spare curse, and that they had made promises to each other that they would never participate in smearing each other in the press like they felt Charles and Camilla had smeared them. And while it's my opinion that Harry is still giving his brother more of a crutch than he deserves, he does say in Spare it became more clear as they aged that they hadn't escaped that dynamic. During big events, big interviews, William could be cruel. Invictus was a big turning point. Harry says that William was pointedly upset that Harry had not run it past him first. I talk a lot on Twitter about how I think that while racism is the number one reason Meghan Markle was treated poorly by both the family and the press, I think that Harry and Meghan's love story was blossoming at a time when William and Kate's was flailing. The Cambridge wedding was really the high point, and I think that Harry shared so many specific stories of William and Kate losing their shit about the Sussex wedding on purpose. William suggesting a small chapel, William being an absolute ass about the beard and uniform. I mean, at this point, William is creeping towards 40 with multiple children, and he's having a tantrum about what his brother is wearing to his own wedding. William repeatedly comes across as incredibly controlling and emotionally insecure. I find it interesting that William enjoyed his heir role in the family as long as it meant he could lord over Harry, but seemed to resent that same position when it meant that he was held to different standards. There were parts I literally rolled my eyes at. William telling Harry he was moving too fast with Meghan when we all know he kept Kate dangling for a literal decade as he, pursued different options. When Harry and Meghan are considering spending half the year abroad, William tells Harry he can't go to Africa because Africa was, quote, his thing. I think if you want some insight to the personal and institutional racism present, there you go. I also wanted to bring up the loss of Jamie Lothar Pinkerton as William and Harry's shared private secretary. Jamie is brought up quite a few times in Spare, and I think both William and Harry viewed him as a father figure. He seemed to respect and care for Harry, and it's hard to see the Sussex situation unfolding the way it did if he had still been somewhat in charge. While some of the passages were chuckle-inducing, I think that Harry describing his meeting with Charles and William after Philip's funeral is probably the part of the book that was, in my opinion, the saddest. William tries to invoke their mother, swearing on her that he just wants Harry to be happy, which is such obvious gaslighting. But Harry goes on to say that this swear was what the brothers used when they were being serious, and it had only been shared between them 2 or 3 times. This time, Harry doesn't believe him, and they both come to that awful realization that their relationship has markedly changed. In the years between leaving full-time military work and dating Meghan, I found Harry searching an obvious theme. I think we often talk about how he was telling journalists years ago that he wanted to find a way to get away from the press. Of course, Meghan Markle is blamed for their exit, and Harry has directly refuted that. But it's also very clear he was searching for a new home from a young age. Basically, every description of a new locale includes Harry picturing it as somewhere he could live. He describes both himself and his brother often trying to find stand-ins for parental figures. It's very clear that decades before he met Meghan Markle, Harry did not have a good sense of family. That he recognized that his family was on some level dysfunctional. I thought it was notable he would kind of imprint that sense of family onto really any group of people who showed him affection. I sincerely hope that Harry was being petty when he points out how well his tour of Jamaica and the Bahamas went. Royalists claim that soft diplomacy is a big reason to keep the royal family on the public payroll, and I think people forget or want to forget that Harry was a good working royal. Despite their best efforts, Harry was consistently among the most popular, usually coming in second only to the Queen in polls. Invictus, Sentibale, Heads Together, Harry breathed life and a personality into the engagements he shared with William and Kate. Not to mention the fact that he had actually served in the military really strengthened the tie that exists between the royal family and the armed services. Later on in the book, Harry gets pretty explicit about, despite his arguably above-average job performance, he was completely dependent on his father for money and was routinely given shabby places to reside, especially per royal standards. The way Harry tells it, being a royal spare is miserable. He's got one of the most recognizable faces in the world. He's sequestering himself into these small dark apartments because facing the press is actively harmful to both himself and anyone he gets photographed with. He's drinking too much. He's trying to work through his grief, and now he doesn't have the distraction the military provided. I thought he was respectful when he brought up Caroline Fleck, and I want to point out that Harry was incredibly respectful towards all of his past romantic partners in Spare. And I think he brought up that fact that after just one photo together, the press went after Caroline's family. Just unhinged behavior by the British press. In 2020, Caroline committed suicide, and it's generally acknowledged that the tabloid press coverage of her played a role in that suicide. And of course, the press wept, and we got some half-assed mea culpas, but nothing changed. Others have said before, the press picks a woman to attack, whether that be Britney Spears or Princess Diana, and they just keep going until something terrible happens. Claim they have learned not to do that, and then just do it all over again when a new target appears. Harry talks a bit about Chelsea Davy and Cressida Bonas. Bonas? I don't know. Harry talks about how dating made women a target, and again, I think he was really respectful in the ways he talks about these relationships and how both of these women suffered at the hands of the press and how both helped him progress in his journey through the grief of his mother's loss. There were, of course, unnamed relationships too. Notably, he quotes the mother of one of these unnamed girlfriends as saying, quote, "They will hound you to the gates of hell," in regards to the press, and she was not wrong. So I have some random thoughts that don't really fit in anywhere. This is the random section. The nicknames all killed me. Willie, Harold, Pa, the names for the press, courtiers, royal, bodyguards, so funny, so weird. I really appreciated that Harry acknowledged that they were being thrown, quote, softball questions at the Royal Foundation Forum. I realize it's not much, but I think it's a little nugget that shows that Harry is aware that as a royal he was treated with kid gloves, and as we watch other royals treat softball questions like the Spanish Inquisition, it's nice to see. I laughed at Harry's comment of goth Meghan when the press was in a tizzy about her black fingernail polish. Harry did pretty much confirm the Diana and Tiggy drama. I didn't know anything about this, but apparently it was quite the story back in the day. Diana thought Charles was cheating on her with Tiggy the nanny. I always appreciate the reminder that Camilla was far from the only one. I'm sure she does too. My conspiracy hat was put back on when Harry said that it took exactly 6 weeks for the British press to find them both in Canada and then in the US. It could totally be a coincidence, but I don't know. It's interesting. I wonder if anyone can think up something that would happen around 6 weeks after a move that might tip off the press. I can't, but it's just a thought. And I totally agree with the thought that Harry wrote about some of his lesser-known poor behaviors on purpose. That he, leaked some of his own scandals in Spare. Both Harry and Meghan seem ready to turn the page, and that the Netflix doc and Spare were their ways of getting their version of their story out to the public. It's hard to move on from an abusive family with their own press corps when they still have ammunition against you. Speaking of that press corps, it's hard to really pin down who comes out worse in Spare, the press or the family. To be totally honest with you guys, I think Harry's too nice to his late grandmother, father, and brother, but I digress. I think throughout Spare, Harry does a really good job at hammering home how absolutely unhinged the British tabloids are, and the human cost that comes with being their target. Whether that's a single photograph of Harry and a girl leading to her full family being investigated, or the fact that the editor who orchestrated the wiretapping of multiple prominent figures walked. I think we all know the British press is fucked up, but Spare humanized that. I liked that while Harry used nicknames for most of the press, he called out Murdoch by name. I completely agree with Harry. It's hard to name someone who has caused more damage to our global sense of reality than Rupert Murdoch. Harry also gives us a perfect description of the problems with the Royal Rota system, saying, quote, "It discouraged fair competition, endangered cronyism, encouraged a small mob to feel entitled." And it's that last part that still gets me every time. I've interacted with some of these folks on social media and they feel completely entitled to every shred of private information. They have these really weird interconnected relationships with certain royal family members. It's not healthy for either party, but it seems like sometimes that both entities, the press and the palace, are in a race to the bottom. And to the outside world, this palace-press relationship is completely bizarre. One of the biggest WTF moments of Spare is that the palace was getting upset with the Sussexes because Archie was a week late, and the press, quote, "couldn't wait forever." Like, what does that even mean? Can they hear themselves speak? How are they not embarrassed? Anyway, I thought the nicknames were funny, although they weren't all that hard to figure out. I thought it was funny how Harry repeatedly points out that all the major Rota routinely print things that just aren't true. It's just, again, as an outsider, the idea of a royal reporter who is in bed with the royals is just silly. And both parties pretend that they are independent of each other when in reality it's just one big incestuous mess. I have always thought it was telling that the British press just cannot accept that Meghan knew little to nothing about the British royal family before she met Harry. Like, these people have such an overinflated sense of their global popularity. I've previously described how I fell into royal watching through a college dorm mate, but when I tell people in my own real life about this YouTube channel, they usually laugh and say, "What?" I joke on Twitter that my husband still thinks that Charles and William are brothers. Like, it just goes to show that royalists really live in their own little bubble and just cannot get over that we aren't all in there with them. That being said, I think everyone who knew more than just the basics of the British royal family and aren't total royalist assholes took one look at Meghan and went, oh no. Now, famously, Tyler Perry sent Meghan a note before the wedding saying, "Just in case, you can call me," and she was like, "That's weird." Meghan was age appropriate. She had a well-documented life before Harry is mixed race and American. Through my earlier royal watching days, I didn't really pay attention to Harry all that much, but I remember seeing the photos from their first Invictus appearance and thinking, this is gonna be bad. And it was much worse than I thought. Spare is a very well-written book, basically the opposite of this video script, and how Harry describes them falling in love is so sweet, and after reading all the shit from his childhood and early adulthood, you are rooting for them. You are rooting for him to be happy, but on the other hand, we already know the ending, which isn't necessarily a bad one, but we all watched the shit those two went through. I found it pretty telling that Harry went out of his way to say that literally everyone in his circle thought Meghan was perfect, except for his family. I also really liked how he makes it clear that Meghan sacrificed a lot to be with him. I don't think it's necessarily a surprise that the first sign of trouble was Harry putting out the first statement where he decried certain press coverage as racist. This was going against institutional norms, and more personally for his father and brother was Harry doing something that men in their family just don't usually do publicly: defend their female partners. It also showed that Harry was emotionally moving past his family. Charles and William are crying that their partners face the same press scrutiny, and Harry is able and willing to tell them, but sorry, they didn't. As Meghan would say in the Oprah interview, rude isn't racist. I found it both fascinating and sad that while on their first tour, Harry realized that Meghan was performing too well, and that there would be trouble with his family. He was already connecting the dots between how Diana was treated after she outshined Charles and what would happen to Meghan if she was deemed too popular. I think it was in the Netflix doc that they said that the treatment from the family did radically change after this tour. I think that Harry kind of glossed over the fact that William showed up to the Sussexes' cottage all hyped up, angry, apparently looking for a fight, and at this point Meghan is heavily pregnant. Like, what was the plan there? I did, though, then find it funny that William was insisting everything was Meghan's fault and that she should apologize, but couldn't name a single thing she had actually done wrong. William's basically a Twitter troll in real life. After watching the Netflix doc, someone on Twitter, who wasn't previously a huge fan of the Sussexes, said they came across as two people who were very likable and obviously in love, and I think that's the same in Spare, and it's here that I think Spare actually does the most damage to the royal family. Especially the younger generation, Will and Kate have tried desperately to present themselves as just another young family, basically normal. Just add the odd royal event here or there. Spare absolutely decimates that narrative. The main players come across as so uptight and so unlikable, high-strung, which in some ways works for Charles, but it does not work for the now Waleses. The first thing that comes to mind is that Harry mentions more than once how opulent their Kensington Palace apartment, which was refurbished by taxpayer dollars, is. I was pretty surprised at how frank Harry is when he lays out that, at least where he was concerned, the press frequently lied about Will and Kate's love story. Most, if not all, the stories about Harry giving his approval were made up. Harry didn't give William the ring for Kate. William had the ring since they were children. William and Harry spent weeks together in Africa right before he proposed to Kate, and yet William never mentioned it, which is super weird. Harry confirms what a lot of us suspected, that the Royal Foundation Forum in 2018 was a turning point in Kate and Meghan's relationship, that it was clear the press would forever be comparing them, and that the comparison wasn't necessarily favorable to Kate. He describes that Meghan had the audacity to ask to borrow her lip gloss, and Kate was obviously miffed. There are a lot of stories in Spare like this, little spats, and I can understand why some people think it didn't need to be said, but I think when you look at them in total, it paints a picture of a very unwelcoming and controlling Will and Kate, and like I said before, just so high-strung, especially to us American readers. I just want to say here in this section that Kate would have had to be medicated if Meghan had worn the Spencer tiara at her wedding. I giggled that Kate showed up to a small family dinner all dressed up, but I mean, what did any of us expect, really? I also giggled that Harry specifically told Meghan not to take a photo in front of the Taj Mahal because of the comparisons that would happen with his mother. Kate famously took exceptionally flat photos with William in front of the monument on one of their shitty tours. And then, of course, there is the famous, or now famous, baby brain comment. Again, the fact that Kate took such an offense to this just comes across so poorly for her. And it's not just the comment, it's the fact that Harry lays out plainly that instead of offering a welcoming hand, Kate made Meghan's life more difficult. And in 2023, mean girls just aren't cool anymore. I go back to this so many times, but the Waleses really, really benefit from a large degree of public apathy. She's pretty and he's Diana's son, and they have a gaggle of cute kiddos, so most people just generally like them. They coast off that, but they don't come out of Spare unscathed. Speaking of help, I've always liked Tyler Perry's movies. Diary of a Mad Black Woman is my personal favorite, and it's also on Netflix right now. My friend Michelle and I used to watch it during sleepovers, probably not age appropriate at the time, but I digress. I have always fought royalists when they say that the royal family was unable to help Harry and Meghan. It's just such bullshit. And when an American filmmaker reached out his hand and did what Harry's family should have been doing this whole time, it just became that much more obvious. I found it really touching that Tyler Perry told Harry that his mother loved Harry's. Perry really went over and above honoring his mother by helping the Sussexes. I think stories of humans helping out others when they aren't really at all obligated warms everybody's heart a little bit. Speaking of men whose names start with the letter T, let's totally switch gears and talk about Tom Markle for half a sec. Harry makes it clear that Meghan thought her father was an easy target for the press, and I find it desperately sad for her that instead of supporting his daughter, Thomas chose to push away the only two people who could have helped him and who understood what it was like to face a tabloid onslaught. Harry tells his audience that the publication of Meghan's letter was the turning point in both Meghan's relationship to him and the Sussexes' relationship to the palace. Tom was obviously cut off, and Harry realized the only reason a tabloid publisher would do something as brazenly illegal as publish a private letter would be because they knew for a fact that the palace wouldn't protect the Sussexes at all. Harry says that during conversations about suing the publisher, both his father and brother spoke as if Harry wanted to sue a close friend of theirs. I found myself wondering a few times if Spare had been further edited after the Queen died. I find it a little suspicious how little she's mentioned. There could be other reasons for that. I think Harry made it pretty clear that he felt that she was being manipulated by the courtiers closest to her. Harry says that he felt her main 3 courtiers had, quote, no use for him and would often placate the Sussexes but do nothing, even when they had been told by the Queen to help. He calls out Angela Kelly by name as a troublemaker who purposefully withheld wedding tiaras. And Harry brings up again that towards the end of their stay as working members of the family, he felt that both himself and Meghan were repeatedly kept away from having any private conversations with the Queen. So I saved Charles for last because I think he's the worst. In his mother's absence due to her advanced age, it was Charles who should have stepped in to protect his son and his new nuclear family. Instead, he left a young William and Harry unprotected when their mother died. He allowed his mistress to sacrifice his sons on her personal PR altar. Charles refused to intervene when it was clear that the boys were at odds with each other and their shared office was in chaos. He begs William and Harry to, quote, not make my final years a misery, but can he really not see the direct role he has played in this collision? This is made worse by Harry describing that Charles seemed to honestly like Meghan on a personal level. I would argue that walking her down the aisle was the best PR Charles had received in decades. It's almost astounding at how badly he fumbled this bag. Then come the comments about how Meghan would maybe have to keep working, that Charles didn't have the money to support the Sussexes, which begs the question, was Charles lying, or is he burning through tens of millions of pounds a year? If the latter is true, what exactly is he spending all that money on? I think Harry was right. A statement defending Meghan at the beginning would have made a difference. He uses the Invictus Games as an example. Meghan's pre-approved wardrobe was ripped apart by the press and the palace said nothing. A statement pushing back against even this very petty grievance would have made a difference. It would have set the tone. Harry openly wonders at multiple times in Spare why Charles absolutely refuses to take on the press. Harry, and the rest of us, can openly see the damage this relationship has done to the family, and yet Charles dithers, tells Harry to stop reading the tabloids. Laughable, Harry explains, since his entire family reads them every morning. Harry is ready for that war, and Charles is not, and you have to wonder how many skeletons are in that particular closet. How many of Charles's mistakes have we never heard of, or William's? The only way that family is breaking free from the press is if they're willing to confront and probably personally release decades worth of scandals, and that just seems like something Charles is unable or unwilling to do. It's also clear through Spare that Harry's problems, which should have been the whole firm's problems, but united his father and his brother against him. They sided with the institution because, let's face it, they are the institution and Harry is the Spare. He's seen as expendable by the institution, which leaves you questioning how these familial relationships are ever supposed to actually work. I'm going to read 2 passages from Spare because I think they do a really good job at summing up how untenable being the Spare is and how this forced infantilization keeps royals in their place. I recognize the absurdity, a man in his mid-30s being financially cut off by his father. But Pa wasn't merely my father. He was my boss, my banker, my comptroller, keeper of the purse strings throughout my adult life. Cutting me off therefore meant firing me, without redundancy pay and casting me into the void after a lifetime of service. More, after a lifetime of rendering me otherwise unemployable. I'd never asked to be financially dependent on Pa. I'd been forced into this surreal state, this unending Truman Show in which I almost never carried money, never owned a car, never carried a house key, never once ordered anything online, never received a single box from Amazon, almost never traveled on the underground. Sponge, the papers called me, but there is a big difference between being a sponge and being prohibited from learning independence. When royalists get all up in arms about Harry choosing to leave the firm, I tell them it's hard to leave something you never really chose in the first place. Harry was born into this role, and this is another place where I heavily side-eye Charles, especially when it comes to the security situation. When Charles made the decision to have children, he automatically made some other choices, whether he acknowledges that or not. One of those choices is that his children would require security for the rest of their lives, and whether that was paid out of taxpayer money or his personal funds is irrelevant. If Charles didn't want to shell out for security, he shouldn't have had kids. Sorry. I'm pleasantly surprised that Harry told the Queen and Charles directly to their faces that by not protecting Meghan, they were damaging the institution. The transition between 2016 Harry and 2020 Harry is noticeable. And he's right. I think Harry's recounting of the Sandringham Summit also offers a pretty good summary of what the Sussexes went through while working for the firm. He's sitting down with the Queen, Charles, and William. They have 5 options already worked out, with the first being they stay as if nothing had happened, and the 5th being the complete severance of ties. His family are all saying they want Harry and Meghan to stay, that things will get worked out. But then the courtiers start passing out papers, and it becomes clear that option 5, full severance, is actually the only option that is acceptable. They dealt with this kind of gaslighting dissonance for years, and I give Harry and Meghan credit because I think I would have started screaming. Harry says in Spare, quote, "My problem has never been with the monarchy, nor the concept of monarchy. It's been with the press and the sick relationship that's evolved between it and the palace." To be honest, I wish he had a little bit more of a problem with the monarchy. I think he gives his father and brother more of a pass than they deserve. I, again, would honestly love to hear Meghan's unfettered opinion on most of this stuff after a few glasses of wine. I also think it'll be really interesting to revisit this statement after he has lived in the United States for 10 or 15 years. The start of Spare is sad, and a good chunk of the middle isn't necessarily happy. So when Harry and Meghan do finally escape to Tyler Perry's crazy-ass house in California and then find their own place, it's just nice. Harry spends so much of Spare telling you how he was longing for a family, and by the end of Spare, he has created his. Overall, I think that Spare was an excellent read. The 400 or so pages go by in a flash. It never felt gossipy. In fact, most of Spare is very serious, albeit punctuated by Harry's sense of humor. It gives readers the license to be vulnerable, to talk about trauma, and to seek help if you need it. 5 stars. Can't wait for the next one. Thank you again for your patience. I have an idea of what my next video topic will be, but I have no idea when I will have it out. Hopefully sometime within the next 2 weeks. Okay, I wrote that 2 months ago. That's probably hopeful. I hope this video finds you well, and I will see you next time.